Hello, everyone, and welcome to this conversation about imagining learning futures. My name is Punya Mishra, and I'm Associate Dean for Scholarship and Innovation at the Marilou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. Thank you for joining us today for this conversation with award-winning science fiction author Simon Brown and my colleague at the Teachers College, Professor Iveta Silova. Just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Learning Futures website. This conversation is part of Future Tense, a partnership between ASU, Slate, and New America that examines the impact of science and technology on society. I'm thrilled that we at the Teachers College have been able to collaborate with the Future Tense team to put together a set of 3 stories and 3 responses to these stories on the theme of learning futures. To provide a bit of background, it is clear to all of us that education has been and will continue to be profoundly affected by changes in technology and science, as well as forces like climate change and globalization. Of course, there is tremendous uncertainty about how to navigate these changes. And as we look to the future, I believe it is critically important that we bring our imagination into play. Fiction provides us with a unique space and opportunity to use imagination to explore the possibilities and challenges that lie ahead. So this set of 3 stories considers how learning experiences of different kinds may be shaped by new technologies and how individual institutions and systems confront the moral and ethical challenges involved. Today, we will be discussing a lovely short story written by Simon called Speaker, and Iveta's response to the story from her expert perspective. Before we start, a bit of housekeeping. We will save time for questions from all of you towards the end, so please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature on Zoom. If you submitted a question in advance, and we already have a few, we will address those as well. You can, of course, use the chat feature in Zoom for just engaging with each other, but please remember, we will only look at the questions in the Q&A section for our discussion. And now I'm excited to get started with this. I know you're not here to listen to me go on and on. So without further ado, let's jump in. Simon, Iveta, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background. Simon, let's start with you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Simon Brown. I'm an Australian writer currently living in South Africa, where my wife teaches. I write in fiction. I write principally speculative fiction, that is science fiction, fantasy, and horror. But I've also worked as a journalist, a communications officer for universities and charities, and I maintain my own blog at the moment. Not as regularly as I would like, but it tends to give way to my fiction writing.
Thank you, Simon. Iveta?
Hello, everyone. I'm Iveta Silova, Professor of Comparative and International Education here at ASU, and also the Director of the Center for Advanced Studies in Global Education. I teach classes on globalization and knowledge transfer, education in the Anthropocene, and post-colonial and decolonial theory in education. And my research focuses recently, at least, on childhood memories from Cold War to the Anthropocene. And I also work with ecofeminist and environmental philosophy to explore the relations between the humans and nature. But on a more personal note, I was born and raised in Latvia, which has a very rich history of storytelling. And I've been a big fan of science fiction and fantasy since childhood. And I always have been curious about the possibility of weaving science fiction in my research and teaching as well. So I'm super excited and very grateful for the opportunity to be a part of this fascinating project. So thanks for organizing it.
Absolutely. And you can see why this was sort of a marriage made in heaven, intellectually speaking, for the story that Simon wrote and Iveta's response to it. So Simon, for those who have not read the story, without too many spoilers, can you give us a quick summary?
Well, the story's main theme is about how 2 people, one a human called Samora and the other a hyena called Akata, are able to communicate with each other and understand each other's frame of mind through the implementation of a new technology, in this case, protein microchips. One of each is implanted in Akata's brain and Samora's brain. This is done under the aegis of an organization called Project Sentience, whose objective is to create as many links as possible between humans and other intelligent species. But the main story, the main narrative in the story, is how Akata and Samora have to learn to cooperate to save the life of a human child.
Thank you. Just to follow up, this is, I think, almost a selfish question because I'm really interested in the creative process. I've done some work in that area research-wise, and I've always been intrigued by how stories, movies, novels come to be, the creative process, as it were. So can you tell us a little bit about how the story came to be? What inspired you? What research did you do? And how did you balance this sort of the research with creating an exciting and actually quite funny story?
Well, it came about because of an organization called Sapiens Plurum, an organization set up to, I'm going to quote here, an organization created to inspire humans to aspire beyond what's humanly possible. And they started a short story competition. The objective of the competition was to, how can technology increase empathy and connections? They wanted authors to imagine ways technology can bring people together and bring us closer, even across species. The actual idea for the story itself came about as one of those weird moments of synchronicity or possibly serendipity. I've always been interested in the technology of protein microchips, which is really a thing that had its heyday in the 80s and has fallen by the wayside because of research into stem cell technology. But the other main thing is that I've always dreamed, and it's still a fantasy, of one day communicating with one of our cousins, you know, Neanderthal or Homo habilis or one of them. So in a way, those ideas fused together and come up with the idea of using this new technology to be able to allow humans and other intelligent species to communicate now. And in this case, between a human and a hyena.
Thank you. And, you know, we just got a puppy. So I have to say this urge to be able to communicate across species is very strong because there's a huge amount of time that I have no idea what's going on in its little brain, but clearly something's going on. But Iveta, back to you. What were your thoughts when you read the story? What intrigued you? What responses or thoughts did it trigger that you then captured in your essay?
Well, I love the story and I love the ending in particularly.
Yes.
Seriously, I thought the story was both really playful and funny, but it also had some openings into really important and serious conversations. And I loved how the speculative science fiction elements of the story were so close to our current reality. It's as if the story was happening just maybe a few days or months or maybe years from now. In the very near future, with only a few elements that may be somewhat unfamiliar, right, or strange to us right now, which makes it very relatable, but also strangely real at the same time. So, for example, while some scientists still debate whether the circle of sentience extends beyond the human, many of us have personally experienced very deep connections with other species, like Punya, you just mentioned with your dog, right? Or many of us with our own companion species, cats or dogs or birds, or even plants and trees in our backyards and parks. But meanwhile, many non-Western cultures already treat all living and non-living beings as sentient, including rivers and mountains or even stones. So, and in some cultures, as I wrote in my response, non-human entities are often granted the same legal rights as humans, as in the case of rivers in New Zealand or glaciers in India, or even here in the United States with Lake Erie. But in our current culture, in the US in particular, but maybe also more generally in Western culture, such human nature interactions are usually limited to personal experiences. And when we bring them up publicly, we are often questioned, oh, is this really real? So the story takes this very personal connection, I think, and builds it into the project, the real, legitimate, fully funded project that spans different species and cultural contexts, and that takes non-human, it really takes non-human sentience seriously. So it's very, very cool in that way. And in a very gentle, kind of non-threatening and playful way, at least to me, it suggests that perhaps humans are not as special or clever as we think we are. And I think this is what really great speculative fiction does. So it makes it possible for us to look at ourselves from a distance of a near future and reflect how our ways of being today may impact our lives just a couple of years or months or hours away. And in this process, we realize that perhaps this near future is already actually not that far away, that it's already all around us, happening now.
Yeah, I mean, I was really thinking about, I mean, this is not that far in the future. We already have, you can put sensors and you can actually think a thought and it'll get typed up on screen. We have chimpanzees controlling cursors on screen. It's so two parts of the equation in some ways technologically already happen. It's that connection in between, Simon, I think, which your story sort of makes, which is the foundation for your story. So Simon, coming to you, what was your response to Iveta's piece? Because I can see as an author, sort of an eye roll is like, oh my God, now these academics are coming in and going to, critically deconstruct what I have been writing. So what did you think of it? And were there ideas in Iveta's piece that resonated with you, or ideas that maybe you hadn't thought of that sort of emerged out of that reading her piece and what she's speaking about now?
Well, 3 points there. The first is that I'm very flattered that an academic would even worry about reading one of my stories. The second point, I'm going to do the third one first, is that reading Iveta's piece made me more aware of how important it is to not assume sentience as a human-only attribute. I mean, I've been willing to grant sentience to many other species, principally other primates, cetaceans, big carnivores, corvids, parrots, a few other species. But if we go that far, then why can't we go a little bit further? And how do we explain the ways that a beehive, for example, works as a single intelligence, despite the fact of having several thousand members? That's a completely different way of approaching sentience than we're used to. The thing that I like most about Iveta's piece, though, was her raising the issue of human exceptionalism. The way that we assume, because we have computers, cars, pens, papers, and can do this, it makes other species, it's not so much that it makes us more intelligent, but it makes other species not in the same league. We sort of assume that they're on a different level altogether of life, that there's human beings and then metazoans, animals and plants and so on, underneath that single cell biota. But in fact, we're also interlinked, that ignoring how we are connected by making human exceptionalism the norm instead of, by accepting human exceptionalism, we're actually doing ourselves damage, not just the natural environment, not just life around us. And I think until we overcome that, we're going to find it very hard to make the planet work the way the planet should be working, the way it used to work, in fact.
Thank you. One of the things that we have been discussing in our college, and Iveta, you'd be familiar with this, is this idea of principled innovation. And the idea that any change or innovation that we do, and Arizona State University is very proud of being ranked #1 in innovation for 6 years. We plastered it on all our buses. If you ever come to Phoenix, Simon, you would see that on every hoarding in town. But one of the things that we have been sort of trying to grapple with and think about is the values, the morals and ethics that come into play when we innovate. That for every act that we take, there are adjacent possibles, there are unintended and intended consequences, and that we need to become more reflective and thoughtful about how these things play out. So this question is for both of you, and I think this time I'll start with you, Iveta. What kind of moral and ethical challenges might emerge from this kind of relationship? And I think particularly around this idea of expanding, or breaking this idea of human exceptionalism. What kinds of moral, because I think the implications for this are, particularly around the work that you've done with iron pre-Iron Curtain countries, or in sort of the post-colonial discourse. I'm just wondering what kind of ethical and moral implications emerge because of the story that allow us to sort of get deeper into some of these things.
Yeah, so I will go here actually back to the issues that Simon just raised and that I tried to really highlight in my response, and that's the issue of human exceptionalism and how deeply it is ingrained in our culture, in our minds, and the roles that education actually plays in kind of reinforcing and legitimizing this culture of human exceptionalism. So the story actually is very realistic in that way, and it shows us a step forward into the multi-species learning, but it also reminds us that it won't be that easy to overcome this delusion and human exceptionalisms that we have. So there are so many moments in the stories that we, can recognize and relate to that really all point to this, even in the near future, the remnants of human exceptionalism, that, they're still there and they're still at play, and they're not going away that quickly or easily. So Samora's father, for example, is just fully dismissive of the project, right? Thinking that it's demeaning to have his son connected so closely to a hyena of all species. And then Samora sometimes doubts the intelligence of the hyena partner. Akata, who is a hyena, needs to remind her human partners that she actually needs some privacy now and then. So it raises all kinds of ethical issues, right? But actually also another funny thing, that the project itself struggles to secure more attention, more funding, more research, more speakers to boost their reputation. It's just very ironic actually how real the story is and how we can imagine it unfolding, tomorrow or this afternoon. So for me, the main takeaway in terms of the ethics and or principled innovation is this: we may have some really awesome technoscience innovations and breakthroughs, and we may insert microchips in our brains to enable multi-species communications, but nothing will radically or fundamentally change and will really change this culture of human exceptionalism until we change ourselves and our ways of being. So it's only when we learn to relate to other non-human beings, and for that matter, also human beings, or other, actually also artificial intelligence machines in more interdependent ways, not in terms of managing them or controlling them all the time for our own benefit, but really in interdependent ways, then we really, I think it's actually our only chance then to learn something new and meaningful and transformative, both for ourselves and the world. So to me, this is principled innovations, putting the interests of the planet and all the species above the interests of just the humans alone.
I love that. And partly because when we think about this line that we draw when we say human exceptionalism, our history was replete, with examples. I mean, you are, Simon, right now in South Africa. You are from Australia. We are living in lands which were Indian lands at one point. And these lines that we have drawn about what is human and what is not has actually shifted, if you think about it historically. So, Simon, just wondering about your responses to your thoughts about this morals and ethics and how they play out, both in your story and your thoughts on that.
I think there are two big moral issues I think that the story might raise. The first, I think Iveta has already dealt with, which is the issue of privacy. Once two minds are linked in this way, how do you stop people from invading each other's thoughts? And would it not be like I described? Once the link is established, would there suddenly be a whole flood of thought? Maybe you wouldn't be able to actually turn them off. And I think that raises a huge ethical issue. And it actually points to the first major moral issue that I didn't have room to really discuss in a 3,000-word story, which is that given the technological capacity to do this, should we do it? What right do we have to suddenly establish that kind of, for lack of a better word, intellectual contact with other species? How do we deal with the issues? How do we discuss this between ourselves before we make the link? And if we do, how do we stop us dominating the recipient species? How do we, just by thinking and talking with them, how do we stop influencing them to do things they wouldn't normally do, which may be not to their benefit, but to their detriment? I'm looking, overall, my opinion is this would be a positive thing, that we would learn from each other, that especially humans would, being able to see through the eyes and see through the mind of another species, how fragile, but also how beautiful and big the world is, would be a plus for both species. And one of the points I didn't actually get to stress too much in the story is that Akata, one of the reasons Akata agrees to be a speaker for the hyena, is that she knows that humans are the dominant species, and it has to be an advantage for her truth. So she's actually thinking in a way that humans might, if an alien species came and says, we're going to give you all this technology, so give it to us, but for God's sake, don't give it to the Russians, don't give it to the, we know what to do with it. And maybe some species would behave in that, not instinctively selfishly, but just just the way that species always look after themselves in a way. They have to. That's
Interesting.
their primary to make sure that their group, their family, and then their community, and then their species, and then their environment are the ones that are advantaged. They don't mind other groups having an advantage. They just want to make sure that they get it. You know? So these are in fact moral issues about how much authority and how much power would we give a Carter. How much would we influence her and her troop in the way they do things? Would it damage them long term? Would it damage their whole ecosystem to suddenly have this huge troop of hyenas with this link being able to do things that no other troop can do? Yeah.
So that's fantastic. And one of the questions that came in previously by somebody who had signed in, they were called themselves, or their name is Eventry, which on internet we never know. And it was again focusing on the ethics. And there's another question that's come in the chat as well. So I think, Simon, you sort of got close to that a little bit, which is the question was around how do you imagine approaching the ethics of kinship as part of a shared framework? And I think that the contradictions that are inherent in, I mean, just among humans, you know, we spoke about Russia, for instance, right? And the selfish interests of different groups. How does that work? I mean, can you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, I might go back one step. Was that one of the issues involved with this communication is how do we know we're actually properly understanding the thoughts we're getting? If we get a thought from hyena, are we interpreting it as a human being? And is that a valid, is does it equate with what they're thinking and saying or believing? And how do we go about finding that out without experimenting with each other?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I'd be fascinated by is what ethical issues would hyenas raise with this communication? What would they, you know, stop, get off my back. I know what I'm doing. You know, don't
Right.
try and convince me I've got to be a vegetarian. That isn't the way we do things, you know. I mean, things like that. I mean, to what extent would they say, stop lecturing? And then would they try and lecture us back? I think that would be a fascinating thing to be lectured to by a hyena. I think. Wonderful.
So one of my friends, B. Lederman, just dropped this question in the chat, and I thought, Iveta, maybe you could sort of talk about, I mean, it's around the same theme. In this conversation about ethics and morals, one thing that jumped out at me in the story was the offer of the humans to provide other animals to the hyenas to repay them for not eating the child. And I love that question. And I wonder if there are any communicators among the eland or kudu herds who are sort of bothered about, like, how are you sacrificing? You know, I mean, one of the speakers could be, Project Sentience could be one of the animals which is going to be sacrificed. So I wonder what kind of issues that raises.
That would raise a very interesting conundrum, wouldn't it? I don't know how you would answer that. I think that in the context of the story, the only reward the hyenas would accept to stop them doing their normal hunt to look for the girl would be to get food for the troop.
Right.
And it would have to be a big antelope to feed the 50 members. So it has to be either in a land or a kudu, or preferably two of them actually to feed 50 to 80 members. But yes, that's an interesting moral point. I mean, do we assist them in killing these things, or let the child die?
Wow. So I'm going to move ahead with another question here. The organization, I think that Iveta, you talked about that, how realistic, because I love that part about they're looking, I mean, I was almost imagining myself as a researcher there, looking for grants, looking for a project which we could get some headlines on that could get us more money. So the organization sort of plays in the fringes of the story, enough details are given, plays a critical role in making it all happen. In my mind, I imagine a corporation like Evil Corp, I don't know, with PowerPoints where the word liver is always spelled with an L. I love those little details. It pays its participants and works across different species, yet is struggling for grants, right? We are given tantalizingly little information about the project on its people and organizations. So for instance, there's a mention that it didn't work with certain species. And I know, Simon, that maybe there's an anthology here of a speaker series that might emerge from this. So is it me, or do I see undercurrents of sort of globally powerful corporations who are, you know, like have new technologies, or undercurrents of maybe colonialism? So what do you think, Iveta?
Well, I think possibly, I mean, it can go either way, right? Like I said before, I mean, my first instinct was that, well, there is definitely some, curiosity to explore the multi-species communications, but moving beyond that concept of human exceptionalism is so incredibly difficult, right? So I can see different organizations probably competing with each other too, ones that are really, truly, genuinely, sincerely interested to learn to communicate with other species, right? And others probably that are really imposing the same, mainstream historical model of human exceptionalism and trying to play by the old rules of the game. So I can definitely see competing interests here at play that will not go away so very easily, right? There is so much at stake, especially, for people with influence and power who have benefited from centuries from their own exceptionalism. I mean, human exceptionalism, but then on top of that, if you bring in Western exceptionalism or American exceptionalism,
yes,
I think that kind of intensifies that even further. So I definitely see that, playing either way, but I like that, you definitely, Simon, leave that ambiguity here, is that there are also, possibly, well, actually, Kata himself seemed to be really genuinely interested, right, in communicated. I mean, Samora, the boy, was really interested, the human was really interested in communicating with the hyena, very genuinely curious. And so I think that's, there's space for that. And like I said, it's already happening in our lives too, right? So these very genuine multi-species communications may not be at the center stage of science or education, but they are happening on a daily basis, right? And so it's kind of neat to bring it into focus.
So one of the things that I thought was really interesting in the story is that the hyena and the boy, they actually communicate. The miscommunication that happens is between the humans, between the father and the child. But you would guess that, within species would be easier. But sometimes I think the story, sort of, maybe Simon, you can speak to that. Was that deliberate on your part to sort of contrast what was going on there? Because there was a play and humor between the interspecies and less of that in the other one, in the human-human one.
I certainly wanted to play out the point that for all our, given the technological capacity to talk with other species, if it ever happened, we still haven't overcome the problem of talking to each other, of misunderstanding each other, or of assuming that someone's ideas and ideology is close to our own and then playing on that, or trying to coerce them to be more like us so that we don't have to reach them halfway. I think one of the things that, the father doesn't come across as being an outstanding individual, I have to admit, but Samora is the one in the end that has to make the effort to go halfway. He has to concede some things because the technology isn't just enabling communication between Samora and Akata, it's interfering with the communication between Samora and his father. And modern technology does do that. It does split generations. I know that, but the communication between me and my parents trying to explain how a computer works and how it can best be used was never straightforward. And now I'm at the age where my children are extraordinarily frustrated because I don't get the technology that they're playing with mobile phones, cell phones, and playing games online, and a whole lot of stuff that I just don't get. I accept it, but I don't pretend to understand a lot of it, and that's real forehead slapping stuff when we're talking sometimes. So those problems can become more serious, though. For example, say you're a pensioner who wants to get a pension, but has to go through computers to do it because there aren't enough humans to talk to. And they just don't know how to do it. They get frustrated. This happens in a country like Australia all the time, where old people are left behind because they're not given the assistance they need to overcome the technological gap. Everyone assumes that they would be able to adapt to it the way that the younger people have, and it doesn't work like that. I find it very hard to adapt to new technology now, but I found it remarkably easy in my 30s.
Yeah, so there's this famous quote, which is like any new technology, if depending on how old you are, if you are, below like 15, 20 years old, then it is the most amazing thing. If you are older, there is money to be made on it. And if you're older than that, any new technology is the end of human civilization. This is the thin end of the wedge, and that's it. We are all going to hell and high water after that. I want to come to
between technology and music. We think the same way about music in the 70s has got to be better than music from the 90s.
Yes. Yeah, I remember reading somewhere that whatever you heard till you were 30 or 35, that's it. Any music after that will always sound discordant to you. It will never, you can still enjoy it, but it's never going to sound right. And
my children call it dinosaur music. Music I listen to.
Yes. So one of the things that struck out to me when I'm looking across the two pieces, when I'm reading Simon, your story, and I'm looking, Iveta, at your response, that you have somewhat slightly different takes on what the story means. So Simon, I read your story as being optimistic at some level. And the first word you spoke about, when you started your conversation today, was that one of the goals was this thing of empathy, right? And so you're optimistic about this new technology of interspecies communication. I felt a slightly different take, Iveta, that there was a somewhat more pessimistic reading. So, I'm going to quote from your piece that nothing will fundamentally change until we change ourselves and the culture of human exception that defines us. So I want to sort of have the two of you sort of take a stance on this sort of more optimistic versus maybe a little more pessimistic view of this. So I'm at some level, I think, setting up a little false contrast, but I think sometimes one does that to get like a good conversation going. So Iveta, let me start with you. And what are your thoughts? History is replete with ways we have gotten it wrong. So I'm sensitive to your perspective there.
Yeah, but let me make it clear. I also read the story really, really optimistically, right? And also, of course, I saw so many current tensions that the ideas that we have been discussing, these remnants of human exceptionalism. I've seen them in the story as well, but overall, also I read it very optimistically. But then and this is the academic speaking in me, right? Because so I love the story and kind of its premise and its logic. And then I turn around to see what we are doing right now, especially in education. And it's just so far away from the multi-species communication, right? Because it's actually really interesting that in schools, we kind of do the opposite, right? We continue to socialize children into these cultures that places human in a steep hierarchy above everyone and everything else in the world, separating the human from the rest of the world and continuing to justify the domination and exploitation of the other, whether other humans or other species or nature itself. And this hyper separation from the natural world ultimately propels us into all kinds of problems, including the ecological crisis that we face, right? That is also human induced. So it's just really, on the one hand, I think the story offers a lot of hope, but then when you turn around, you see how hopeless the situation is in some ways, right? Because the dominant culture really does not leave much space at all for these different type of more interdependent culture, right? And more interdependent ways of coexisting with other species. But then again, as an educator, I'm thinking it's actually a really nice way to use a story to unfold some of these ideas and bring some of these issues into the field of education. And begin the conversations. But I also have to admit, I also think that this whole idea of human exceptionalism is almost a taboo topic in education too, yes. Because, how can you critique the idea of mass schooling, right? Or public education that is supposed to be the big equalizer of all, right? It's a very, very difficult topic to approach. But I think actually the science fiction, speculative fiction offers a space to at least begin the conversation, right? And imagine the world differently. And notice, like I said before, that some of these alternative other ways of being and coexisting actually they do exist. They're just not in the mainstream necessarily, at least in education.
So before I jump to you, Simon, just thank you, Iveta, for the point that you made that stories like this open up points of conversation. And in fact, as a part of the Principal Innovation Project, and we will be making the story and this webinar available so that others can use it as a case study for having exactly these conversations around these topics. And there's a lot that can be unpacked there. So that's something that's part of the overall plan. So Simon, your take on the more optimistic versus pessimistic. And again, I am putting a black and white read on it, and I apologize for that, but it's okay.
Well, I actually think Iveta's point of view wasn't pessimistic. I think it was just stating the case that we have to understand ourselves better and break down that myth, that shield, perhaps, of exceptionalism. And my story is optimistic because I think it shows one of the ways that might happen. It is by exposing people everywhere to what it might be like to communicate with another species. We'll show them that we share the world with other intelligent creatures, and we have to make allowances for that. I think humans are very good at being empathic, and we can see that if the way that we, for example, you talk about having a puppy. I mean, humans are one of the very few species that will always like the young of another species. I mean, I saw the young of an octopus the other day, and it was cute, for God's. I don't know why. I don't know how that works. It's made the shape of the body or the size of the eyes in relation to it, but we want to protect it. We want to nurture it. And we may change our mind when it gets a bit bigger, but the point is, I think humans have the capacity through their empathy to change the way the world is run at the moment. And if we can show them how other creatures are feeling, what they're thinking, how they view the world, that might be a big step towards achieving that. So I think Iveta's point is valid, and my story is optimistic because it's a way of moving towards what Iveta would like us to achieve.
So there's a question that popped up on chat that I want to add because I think it's relevant at this point in time. This is Sina. I'm going to pronounce the name wrong, and I apologize in advance. Mirze, maybe it's Sina Mirze. I apologize again. But the question, I think, is very relevant to what we're talking about. Can human exceptionalism be defined by its various origins? For example, the realization that humans are more capable of deductive reasoning than some other species. An alternative perspective would give rise to the realization, acknowledgement, and appreciation that certain species are more capable than humans in other processes. And this has been something, I think you mentioned this, Simon, earlier, this that you have this urge to try to see the world from what it would look like to, Thomas Nagel has a famous essay called What Does It Like to Be a Bat? And with this puppy, I keep thinking, with the number of sensory cells for smell, I wish I could tap into his brain and see the world as smells. I am not seeing the world as it is. I'm seeing it filtered through a whole bunch of expectations and learnings and biases and and filters that, as humans, because of our senses, we are limited to, but also because of our learnings, we have been limited to. And so I'm wondering how you would, either of you can jump in on this, that this understanding that either that we can, so the question is in two parts, and one is saying that humans are here where we are on a Zoom call, which no other animal on this planet can do. That speaks to our exceptionalism, but are there other ways of being that we may not be sort of recognizing? Anybody, either of you can go first and then respond.
I think the thing about human exceptionalism is that we regard those things that make us special as being the things that put us above other animals. Whereas, I mean, I wish I was quadrichromatic. I wish I could see into the ultraviolet or the infrared. Other animals can do that. So does that make them exceptional? Does that put them above me because they're exceptional in that particular regard? As you said, the sense of smell, a whale's sense of hearing. I bet you dolphins, I'm not going to take it back because I'm going to lose it, I know, but I always wondered if, because a dolphin communicate with each other sonically, does that mean they don't need words like above and below and around? All they have to do is send a sonic image of what they're thinking about to another dolphin. Mm-hmm. So they don't actually have to explain in an abstract way where something is. They just have to show it. And that's exceptional. It does mean they may not, I'm not saying they don't, but it does mean they may not, for example, be able to develop abstract thought to the level that we have, but they can do so much else that we can't. So maybe it isn't about fighting human exception so much as accepting that all animals, all creatures are exceptional in their own way, and they have the same rights to share the world that we do. I'm not sure if I went off beam that time, but
no, that's great. Love it.
But I have, so actually I wanted to mention a couple of things. So the first one, so I read a few of the commentaries, after the, on Slate, after the essay. And of course, there were a lot that are really angry, like even with the idea of considering the multi-species communication as something meaningful. But then there were also some that were, pretty good, right? And very interesting. And one of them was, well, if we humans think we are so great and so technologically advanced, why do we always force others to learn our language, right? Whether, why can't we use our technology and actually learn the language of other species, right? Why haven't we really thought about it in that way? So I thought that was pretty cool, right? Because, but that would be too much for us, of course, for humans to do. But then on this other note, I'm actually glad that I have this opportunity to bring in the work of Lynn Margulis, the evolutionary biologist, and who said that basically the difference between human and non-human species is just a matter of degree and not of kind. And I had this, and again, I think this was one of those moments of synchronicity for me, because I was happened to read one of her articles called the Sentient Symphony at the same time as your story came. So I almost kind of read them at the same time. And it was so fascinating because there's just one quote from this essays that Lynn Margulis wrote that is almost directly responding to the story. And I just wanted to share that with you because it very directly addresses the issue of human exceptionalism, but it also brings in the whole idea of, actually links to the joke that the Akata makes at the end of the story. So so Lynn Margulis basically, talks about this, that there is this dazzling array of reasons that the scientists list to imply human superiority over the rest of life, right? So, that's the questions that one of the people in the audience asked, right? So like, what are the different, how do we define human exceptionalism? And so there are all kinds of lists that people make. And she says that among these reasons is like one of the main ones that people agree on is that humans are the only beings capable of wholesale self-deception. And this claim is based on the early humans' presumably delusionary belief in the afterlife, right? And, when, people were buried, the other objects would be buried with them that may be helpful in the afterlife, right? And so, and Lynn Margulis writes, and so this is where I quote, she says, "How ironic that we, in seeking examples of our superiority over the rest of life, have finally congratulated ourselves on a trait that threatens to negate all the others. Although members of other species trick one another, humans are the expert self-deceivers. As the best symbol users, the most intelligent species, and the only talkers, we are the only beings accomplished enough to fully fool ourselves." So I just thought it was such a perfect connection.
That's lovely.
And almost like a direct communication of Lynn Margulis from a couple decades before, speaking, just introducing.
She's wrong. There is an afterlife. She's communicating with us.
I know.
Yes.
Exactly.
So that's.
And it goes also, for that matter, to the ancestral communication too, right? Which is, again, in Western cultures may be dismissed. So we are joking about it, right? But I mean, there is also seriousness to that too.
Yeah, well, I guess it could be our cultures, in fact, the way the ancestors talked to us.
Mm-hmm.
I love that quote. And again, I mean, this whole breaking apart of human exceptionalism, Lynn Margulis is a great example, even with the Gaia hypothesis, right? Where the entire planet can be seen as an organic whole. There's a question, it's a long comment and question from Svetansu Mahapatra. I think I'm going to sort of, he gives a lot of examples of different cultures which have been able to, or from the Amazon or from India, who feel this communication or connection with nature. So the question is, do you think perhaps they're already communicating with non-human species at a subconscious level, but our brains are just not able to sort of appreciate it or comprehend it?
I think it happens all the time. I think with our pets, when we're in this, when I'm swimming and there are those creatures around you, watch them and you get signals from them. They let you know when you're getting too close. And they let you know when they're curious about you. Now it's amazing how something as small as a tiny coral fish will come up and knock on your faceplate, on your mask, just to see what's behind there. But totally unafraid, obviously very curious about what you are and what the hell you think you're doing down there. And how, if they hold you down, what will happen in an hour's time? I'm sure that's going through their brain. But I think we communicate with those species all the time, one way or another. I think one of the points I think you make, Iveta, I can't remember if it's in your essay, but when we were talking afterwards, perhaps, about when you hug a tree, where you're communicating with it. I don't think we pretend that we're talking to it in that way, but we still, we're establishing a link with another life form.
Yeah, there's this wonderful book by the physicist Alan Lightman on sort of essays on his life as a scientist and as a writer, because he manages to somehow juggle both of those things. And he has this wonderful moment that he has with this bird. And he's speaking to this sort of moment where these two species recognize each other, and this powerful sort of an aesthetic response that it has in him. It's a really wonderful passage in that book, and I think speaks to sort of Svetanshu's question in some way. There were a couple of questions. I think one question around sort of the process of writing. So Simon, maybe you can speak to this one. So this is somebody who is an entomologist, and they really want to write science fiction. It's not clear to me exactly what the question is, but I think the question is like, do you have to keep to all the scientific rules in order to write a science fiction story, or can you play loose and easy with the science? How closely do you adhere to the laws of science, so to speak?
As a writer of fiction, my first rule is to entertain the reader. Because if I lose the reader, I can't get anything across. I can't get across the point I'm trying to make or illustrate a scientific point I think is relevant or important. The only point in this story, for example, where I stretch the science a little bit is that I'm assuming that I have to, for the sake of the reader, assume that the communication between Akata and Samora is like we have a conversation. But in fact, I don't think it would be anything like that. I don't think in a 3,000 word story you can actually accurately display or describe what it would be like to communicate with another species. I think 90% of it would be like code, that all that stuff that comes before you used to be able to get on a computer 40 years ago before the actual message arrived. No idea what it means. It's just noise. And the other point is that at the end, Akata gets the point of humor very quickly. And I don't know that, I think I stretched that point. I don't think it would happen that quickly. But I did check up on my sources. My first point of contact was Wikipedia, but never use Wikipedia as your main source. Always go to the journals and papers. So I backtracked and went to the journals page they talked about. I discovered about how in some tests, for example, hyenas are more cooperative than chimpanzees and stuff like this. And I've always been drawn to hyenas ever since I've come to Africa, because they always seem to be such an undervalued animal, at least in Western culture. They're always the villain in a Disney film, for example. But in fact, they're the most successful predator on the continent. I mean, spotted hyenas are hunters. They're not scavengers. They don't mind scavenging if they can, because it reduces the risk of injury. But they're much more successful than lions or leopards or cheetahs at getting prey, and even more successful than wild dogs, who are my second favorite African animal, I have to point out. And also, I mean, hyenas belong to the cat family, but they've got this amazing, almost primate social structure. Well, the spotted hyena does so, not the other species so much. I'm losing track of the question. Science fiction.
Yeah, the science. Yes.
Always,
No, that's great. Yeah.
Always research the science, but don't be afraid of stretching a point. Just don't do anything which is anti-science. Don't do something which is absurd. I think there are a couple of exceptions. I mean, no one in science fiction will criticize you, for example, for having a ship that travels faster than light, even though the technology for that is probably still centuries ahead of us, if it ever happens. But go ahead, you know. But in this case, when the actual point is a science, I think it's important to stick to as close to it as you can. There's a whole lot of science I didn't put in the story because it would have bored readers and would have flowed over the 3,000 word limit.
There you go. So I think one of the moments, just to make follow up on the point that you made, that this communication would not be that straightforward. I think a powerful point in the story is when the sensory, I feel it's going to be much more at the sensory level than it's going to be at the linguistic level, right? So Iveta, this is a question from you from Stephen Weiner, and I think that it's a great question. I'm looking at the times and making sure that we cover this question. So to Iveta's point, Western education system is predicated upon nature/society divide and human exceptionalism in ways that are deep and unseen. So he asks a very sort of almost like a pragmatic question, which is how can we help educators uncover and then reimagine fundamental relationships, teacher, student, nature, humanity, and redesign institutional structures, schools, discipline, assessments, etc. I think that's, like, yes, we have this vision that we need to break these silos. We need to, rethink beyond these boundaries because our lives depend on it at some level. But how does one go about doing that? So, and this is something that I know you have spent a lot of time thinking about. So maybe you can share some thoughts.
Absolutely. But so I want to actually start by acknowledging that, that there is a lot that's happening outside of the mainstream education system, right? And especially non-Western education systems that actually are much more open and attuned to the multi-species worlds, right? So whether it's indigenous education cultures, or even if we look at Japanese or Chinese or Indian schools, in many non-Western cultures, there are lots of practices, including education practices, even if they are non-formal, with this, other more interdependent way of being is practiced, and also more interdependent ways of learning is practiced on a daily basis. But I also wanted to give a shout out to my colleagues in the Common Worlds Research Collective, which is an international interdisciplinary group of colleagues working in the areas of early childhood education mostly, but not only. But so they actually also have a really excellent point that before children get to schools, they are already eco-socialized in very interdependent ways with the nature and with other species. They see themselves as part of the larger world, as a small part of a larger world, right? Not being dominant, but it's when they come to school, when they learn to be the dominant species, right? Exceptional to everybody else. So we already practice a lot of these ways of interdependence. It's just we are unlearning it in school. And so I think, first of all, we need to bring that, I think, to the table, to policy debates in very direct ways, and begin discussing it as a real issue that is not just some fluff that others are doing, right? I think at this stage, there is all kinds of evidence already here that more interdependent ways of beings will help us, being with each other will help us survive on this planet, right? During this particular time, the age of men. So I think we just need to really seriously engage with it and begin changing who we are and how we learn together with the rest of the world.
Thank you, Iveta. I'm just looking at the time and want to make sure that I think we have covered most of the questions that have come in. So since this is broadly a discussion of learning futures, I'd like each of you to sort of speak to what the characters of what is the learning that happened in the story, right? So maybe Simon, you can go first, and then Iveta.
I think in Akata's point of view, she's learning more about humanity. She certainly learns about humor, but I'm not going to talk about it too much because that's the point of the story to some degree.
Right.
Samora learns two things, and the first and most important thing, I think, is to communicate better with his father. That communicating with another species is wonderful, but we can't forget speaking to each other, which is the basis of community for us and the basis for all the things we wish to achieve. The other thing I think Samora will learn, and this is in that imaginary world that happens after the story finishes, is that he learns not to take for granted Akata, that Akata's adaptability and intelligence is fiercer, that's not quite the right word, but sharper than even he gave her credit for. She's a leader, and she feels really heavy responsibility towards protecting her troop, at the same time as being endlessly curious about the world of humans, and particularly one human, Samora. So, I mean, if, for example, this was a 10,000 word story, it will be very interesting to see how that relationship develops.
Thank you, Simon. Iveta?
Well, I think Simon already mentioned all kinds of great ideas and learnings, but I mean, I'll just emphasize maybe one more time that I hope that Samora learns that he can learn from hyenas, right? That there is a lot that he can learn, that hyenas can crack pretty funny jokes too. And, that there's a lot of benefit and I guess pleasure and happiness too, but also probably lots of uneasy moments too, right, in this communication. But I think I hope that one of the main learnings is also about the interdependence, right? That it's not all about managing others, but, you really need to trust others and learn to live independent life.
Part of the story had been longer is for Samora to be in touch with another speaker who had failed. And that would have dramatically increased the tension. But again, it's not something you can do in 3,000 words.
3,000 words.
Lessons learned from that failure that would have helped Samora and Akata overcome the challenges of being speakers for their own species.
Yeah. Interesting. One of the questions I had, which we didn't get to, was what other alternative paths had you thought about, Simon? So I think thank you for sharing that, because I didn't get a chance to get to that question. We are really getting close to our time. Any last thoughts or comments that either of you want to add before I go into closing and acknowledgements?
Well, thank you everyone for the support, for getting the story out there, and Iveta for your amazing response. I mean, it broadened what the story means and its implications, I think, beyond I certainly what I had expected. And Arizona State University has done wonders for me as a writer, the support they're giving. So thank you to, and also thank you for all the amazing questions. And one very quickly, the person who asked, the entomologist who asked about writing science fiction. Entomology is a great start for science fiction story. It's an entire new way of looking at life and behaving in life. And as an entomologist, I don't have to tell you that as an entomologist, but for God's sake, it's what you know about, so write about it. And they're fictional as well as a scientific way.
Yeah, I was thinking of Hofstadter's Godel's Scherbach, where he has this one whole conversation with an anthill. The collective intelligence. Anyway, Iveta,
I just would like to thank everyone, our audience, Punya, for organizing this, but Simon, especially you, for just offering such a wonderful opening to engage in this really important conversation, while in a really playful and such an enjoyable way. It's really amazing that allowed us to raise so many serious and very difficult questions. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And Simon, just to add, the person who asked the question about writing has said that they will now write a story around entomology. So that's wonderful. So Simon, Iveta, thank you so much for joining us and for the pieces you wrote. Thank you to all of us, all the people who are watching, and for your questions and comments. I also want to make sure to thank all the people who made this series and event possible. First, thanks to the Future Tense team, including the folks at Slate, New America, and ASU Center for Science and the Imagination for working with us on this collaboration. Thanks and gratitude to the Principal Innovation team. The funding for this comes from there. The marketing and events team who made this work so smoothly, and my colleagues in the Office of Scholarship and Innovation at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College for all the work that they did to make this possible. We encourage you to check out the second story of the series by Lee Alexander, which will go live on Slate on February 27th. Coming up after that is a story by Shiv Ramdas, with responses by experts with webinars to follow. So this is the format we'll be going for the next 3 months. At the beginning of March, I will be back to host the second discussion, and I hope you will join us then. You can learn more about the Learning Futures at Teachers College by going to learningfutures.education.asu.edu. With that, thank you again, Iveta, Simon. A wonderful conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Be safe.
And thank
Yeah,
you,
be
Sapiens
good.
Plurum, for kickstarting the whole thing.